Okay, our next lecture, let's go ahead and get a little more headroom on that, see if we can, is Great Promise, Bitter Disappointments, period from 1960 to 1974. Now, starting out, Kennedy and the New Frontier. Now, when we get to the turn of the decade of 1950 to 1960, people thought we felt a lot of constraints. We thought we were losing the Cold War. We had the U-2 incident, which heated up the Cold War again. Sputnik showed that Russia had gotten a satellite into space and were ahead of us. Fidel Castro, the revolutionary in Cuba, who we thought might go with America, in turn goes around and goes with Russia. And then we enter the recession of 1960, where there's a lot of increasing unemployment, and our national debt was up to $488 billion. Which may not seem like a lot of money now. It was a huge deal back then. Ready to go to the next slide? So who are our candidates going to be? Well, for the Republicans, it was Richard Milhous Nixon, who had already was well known as he was Eisenhower's vice president. His adversaries had already begun to call him Tricky Dick. He had a shrewd intelligence, a love for politics. He was born into a struggling Quaker family, moved into politics, and basically never looked back. What did he want? Well, he wanted to improve everybody's life. And what about the Democratic candidate? Well, the Democrat was a young John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who was inexperienced, even though he did have a record of heroism from World War II. He had a glamorous wife, a Harvard education, movie star charisma, but the 43-year-old had not distinguished himself in his service in either the House or the Senate. He was a guy who came from wealth, led by his father, Joseph Kennedy, who had made his money from gin running during Prohibition and Wall Street. They had invested in the Hollywood film industry. Then he began to develop and train his sons and to become president. And the guy who was actually the son who was actually supposed to rise to the presidency was John Kennedy's older brother, Joseph Jr. But he had finished his flight crew in World War II. He was about ready to come home, but they had a secret mission where basically they were trying to blow up this dam, and they didn't know how they were going to be able to do it. So one of their thoughts was to fill a B-24 with explosives, have somebody take it off, fly for about 15 minutes over the English Channel, switch it over to remote control, and have the pilot bail out. Well, Joe Jr. knew this would be a great publicity for him, so he goes ahead and he volunteered for the mission, and 5 minutes after they took off, the plane mysteriously exploded. We don't know why. So quickly they preened John to the position. And what did he want for the American people? Well, basically to improve everybody's lives. He'd traveled more than 65,000 miles, visited 25 states, made over 350 speeches. And when he was accepted as the Democratic candidate at the convention, he gave his own acceptance speech where he claimed, "We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, a frontier of unfulfilled hopes and threats." He focused on the potential of the future as he knew Americans loved this theme. And that's why the press kind of took up his new frontier. Now, what were his negatives? His negatives were the fact that he was so young, and he was also Catholic, which was shocking back then. And for those of you who think that maybe we've gotten over the whole religious thing, well, maybe, but maybe not. Because I remember when Mitt Romney was running for president, and a lot of people were concerned that he was a Mormon. And so, who knows? Anyway, his focuses, the big negatives were his age and his religion. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, but Nixon then made the mistake of accepting a televised debate with Kennedy. The debates had never been televised before. And at the studio, basically he got up there, unlike Kennedy, who already had connections with Hollywood, so he knew how to put on makeup, how to look at the camera, everything like that. Nixon didn't put on makeup, he didn't even shave, he had just gotten over a sickness. John F. Kennedy was right by the air conditioning, whereas basically Nixon was left out baking under the lights. So he looked really bad. And what were the results? Well, from the television audience, if you watched it, 70% of the audience thought that Kennedy won. However, if you only heard these debates on the radio, 90% thought that Nixon won the debates. Excuse me. So, regardless to say, Kennedy's popularity shot up in the polls, but to woo black voters, there was a crucial incident down in Georgia. In Atlanta, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and 50 others had been arrested for trespassing in an all-white restaurant. And while others were released, King was sentenced to 4 months in jail for an earlier traffic infraction. John's younger brother, Robert, called the judge and informed him that if he was a decent American, he would let King out of jail by sundown. King was released, and basically the Kennedys took advantage of this by distributing some 2 million pamphlets in black neighborhoods, reminding them that they got Martin Luther King Jr. out of jail. Ready for the next slide? So what were the results of this election? Well, guys, it was terribly close. Out of the 68 million votes cast, Kennedy won by a margin of only 118,574 votes. And in some contested states like Illinois, you had Richard Daley's Democratic Machine that lived up to its motto that extolled the people to vote early and to vote often. Nixon indeed had carried more states than Kennedy, strongly holding on to the West and 4 of the 6 southern states. But Kennedy won New England and the mid-Atlantic states and some key states in the South, where it was the black vote that gave him the margin of victory. You ready? All right, next slide. The new frontier. Well, basically, Kennedy was the youngest ever elected president, even though he wasn't our youngest president, who of course was Teddy Roosevelt at 42. But at 43, John F. Kennedy is still our youngest president. At his inauguration, where he extolled the people to ask not what your country could do for you, but what you could do for your country, he pledged that his administration would go after the common enemies of man: tyranny, poverty, disease, and war. Now, ready for the next slide? Basically, to solve problems he was going to put in experts. So they brought in like Rhodes Scholars, Harvard professors, and basically they told people that his lack of experience was good. Just like some people did with Obama, just like some people did with Bush, just like some people did with Trump. Because basically they're not part of the Washington machine. And with his 35-year-old brother, Robert, was made the Attorney General. And so it seemed like we were ready to go. All right, next slide. Guys, basically remember, Kennedy did not win by a huge majority. So he pretty much had to play politics of the virtual center. Couldn't go too far left, couldn't go too far right. Now, he did focus a lot on domestic programs. Like he got a new housing act where $5 billion was set aside for urban renewal. He raised the minimum wage from $1 to $1.25, or 25%. In the Area Redevelopment Act of 1961, it gave more than $400 million in loans and grants to distressed areas. There was an increase in Social Security, additional funds for sewage treatment plants, and he won support for an accelerated space program with the goal of landing on the moon by the end of the decade. And while he did get those things passed, other advances that he wanted were bottlenecked. Ready to go to the next slide? The new economics. Basically, Kennedy wanted to try to shape national policies through taxes. And we've kind of seen that with what they did with cigarettes and making the taxes on them very expensive in the hopes of cutting down people's smoking, which it had. The defense budget was increased 20%. Unemployment fell 2%. They went about trying to install national and wage guidelines across the country that U.S. Steel tried to fight against, but basically they said, if you don't do it, we're going to use the Army and go in and have the government kind of take over your factories. So U.S. Steel caved in. All right, getting ready to go to the next slide. Kennedy and civil rights. Guys, contrary to what has been popularized, Kennedy really did, civil rights weren't that important to him. He made very cautious moves. Like, true, Thurgood Marshall, the lead attorney for the Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education case, he was promoted to the Supreme Court, making him the first African American on the Supreme Court. But on the flip side, he also promoted judges that supported segregation in other federal offices and judgeships. And even though he had the opportunity, he did not ban racial segregation in federal housing. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, just because the government isn't doing anything, does that mean that the civil rights movement has stopped? No. In Greensboro, North Carolina, well, I'll start again. Ever since the Montgomery boycott of 1955-56, King's philosophy of militant nonviolence inspired others to challenge the deeply entrenched patterns of racial segregation. Now, the first genuine mass movement began when 4 black college students sat down and demanded service at a whites-only Woolworth counter in Greensboro, North Carolina on February 1st, 1960. Basically, it was called the sit-in movement. And within a week, the sit-in movement had spread to 6 more towns in North Carolina. And within 2 months, you had demonstrations that occurred in 54 cities and 9 states. Ready to go to the next slide? You start to have the rise of CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality, combined with King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SLSC, began to broaden the movement. To basically integrate public facilities. And once again, remember that there are blacks and whites activists taking part in this movement. Ready to go to the next slide? Basically, sit-ins became kneel-ins at churches, wade-ins at segregated public pools. Everywhere they demonstrated, the protesters refused to retaliate, even when struck with clubs or poked with cattle prods. And during the years after the Greensboro sit-ins, more than 3,600 black and white activists spent some time in jail. Some were pelted with rocks, burned with cigarettes, and subjected to demeaning verbal abuses. Indeed, in Orangeburg, South Carolina, officers used fire hose against the demonstrators in sub-freezing temperatures. And then you have the arrival of the Freedom Riders. Basically, in 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, sent a group of black and white Freedom Riders on buses to test federal court rulings that ban segregation on buses and trains and in terminals. Because basically, remember, if you get on a bus that's going from one state to another, federal law oversees that because it's interstate commerce. Whereas if they just got on a bus that all stayed in Texas or Alabama or Minnesota, that would be intrastate. Well, how did the people respond to this these black and white activists writing? Well, the reaction varied. In Alabama, mobs attacked the travelers with fists and pipes, burned one of the buses, assaulted Justice Department observers. But demonstrations began to garner more and more national attention. In 1962, Governor Ross Burnett of Mississippi, who believed that God made the Negro different to punish him, defied a court rule and refused to allow James Meredith to enroll at the University of Mississippi. Well, Attorney General Robert Kennedy sent federal marshals to enforce the law. They were assaulted by a white mob, and after 2 deaths and many injuries, federal troops were called in. And Meredith was finally allowed to register at Ole Miss a few days later. Meanwhile, in Birmingham, Alabama, you had Eugene Bull Connor with a force using attack dogs, tear gas, electric cattle prods, fire hoses to prevent recreation of where they were marching basically to Birmingham, Martin Luther King and others. And on Good Friday, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested and thrown into jail. It's there where he wrote a letter from a Birmingham City jail where he stated that one who breaks an unjust law must do so lovingly and with a willingness to accept the penalty. Of course, he also wrote freedom was something that was never given voluntarily by the oppressor. And basically, hereafter, King began to emphasize the importance of educating Southern whites about the injustices of segregation and other patterns of segregation. He focused on gaining federal enforcement by provoking racists to display their bitter hatreds in public. And King grew so much in stature that the head of the FBI labeled King the most dangerous Negro to the future of this nation. And his nonviolent coercion earned him a Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Oops. And basically, like I told you, when you had Bull Connor, who's there in the glasses, yay! Basically, when he's showing all this, it's going out to a national audience where people can see how violent it is. He has the March on Washington on August 28, 1963, attended by more than 250,000 people, where he gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. The dream where one day someone would not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Ready for the next slide? Oh, is the world ready for that? No. Basically, the weekend after the "I Have a Dream" speech, 4 little girls were killed in Alabama because they showed up early for church. Basically, one had new shoes and new gloves, and she wanted to show everybody else. So they were all friends, and they all showed up. A bomb had been planted at the church. And basically it exploded, and those 4 little girls were killed. Now, of course, why do you think that they're attacking churches? Well, because, guys, most of you who go to a house of worship, you know that basically that church, you're your own community in there. You know everybody in your little Sunday school class, or you also know some of your fellow congregants. And the way you try to divide up members of the community is you destroy focal areas in that community. Y'all ready for the next slide? Okay, foreign relations. Flexible response. Ready to go on the next slide? Basically, in foreign policy, we were much more comfortable, especially because there was a 20% defense increase. So we have a nuclear increase where we're building more nuclear bombs. We want to have more than them. He issued the challenge of the space race so that we wouldn't feel technologically inferior to the Soviets anymore. To friendly nations, basically you give them money, especially in South America. It was called an Alliance for Progress. And in March of 1961, basically the Peace Corps was started, or a group that basically is made up of Americans that would go down, that would help them build wells, that would help with community projects for the aid of villagers. And what would we do to the countries that we didn't get along so well with? Well, basically we try to destabilize their countries through the use of covert operations. The CIA. Ready to go to the next slide? Like there's Latin America. And I told you about the Alliance for Progress. But the CIA also began to train Cuban exiles. Basically more than 1,500 anti-Castro Cubans. And what basically they were going to do is they were going to train them in the military, everything like that. These guys were going to land at the Bay of Pigs, which is where Fidel Castro started his revolution. And basically they would go back in and start a revolution against Fidel Castro. And when the invasion force landed on April 17th, 1961, all of a sudden the air support that America had promised them, we refused to do it. So the Cubans become stalled, and in 2 days, more than 1,100 men are captured, making America look like fools to our friends, rascals to our enemies, and incompetents to everybody else. Next slide. In Asia, we have the CIA carrying out raids in China as well as in North Vietnam. Basically, the CIA used a front company called Air America in Laos that was used to basically carry the men and supplies where they needed to go. And 2 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy met with the Soviet Premier Khrushchev in Vienna, Austria. And it was very tense with Khrushchev trying to browbeat Kennedy, you know, this young guy. Khrushchev, at this meeting, Khrushchev threatened to limit access to Berlin. So in response, of course, Kennedy asked Congress for more defense funds. Basically, he was doing it to show American resolve by calling for more defense funds and calling up the Army Reserves and National Guard units. Ready to go to the next slide. And the Soviets, why, they weren't going to back down. So they start to build the Berlin Wall. Which cut off movements from east to west Berlin, plugging up the most accessible escape route to East Germany. And this also showed the US's resolve to challenge our strengths in Europe because it was a barrier in opening up our new diplomacy. Then, on October 14th, 1962, from spy plane photos, we noticed that they were building missile sites in Cuba, which was only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This, the Soviets felt would, and the Cubans as well, felt that it would protect against an American invasion. And the danger of them was, of course, is that they could be launched, take off, and hit their targets before we could react to them. Now, guys, we had missiles in Turkey that basically could do the exact same thing to Soviet Russia. But we didn't want those missiles there. So, what are we gonna do? Basically, the military, as you can guess, wanted an immediate invasion or a surgical airstrike. But Kennedy's like, no, that's going to start World War III. So basically, we opt for a blockade of Cuba. But because blockade is a military action, Kennedy called it a quarantine. And we said basically that Cuba was in quarantine. We gave the Soviets a line that their ships could not cross. And on Monday, October 22nd, the president goes before the public with pictures and pronounced a naval quarantine. Well, guys, was this a big deal? Yeah, we've never been closer to a nuclear war. Indeed, Khrushchev stated that Kennedy had pushed humankind to the abyss of a world nuclear war. Tensions increase, and on Wednesday, October 24th, 5 Soviet ships who had threatened to run the quarantine instead stopped just short of the line. Well, basically, we then get 2 messages from Khrushchev. And one of them, Khrushchev said the missiles were to be withdrawn if we don't invade Cuba. And it was written late at night. The second one, instead of being conciliatory, was a demand to withdraw the missiles from Turkey. And even though Kennedy had already ordered this, Khrushchev didn't know that. And so, of course, Kennedy now refused and rescinded the order. So, basically, on October 28th, we do respond to the first message, however, not to the second one. And basically, we promise that we won't invade Cuba. And on October 28th, Khrushchev removed the missiles. Well, what's kind of the after effects of this almost conflict? Well, basically, tensions began to subside. You had some symbolics taken, like we sell the USSR surplus wheat. We install a hotline telephone between the US and USSR. America, we finally did remove those obsolete missiles in Turkey, Italy, and Britain. And on June 10th of 1963, a treaty with the USSR and Britain, we all agreed to stop nuclear testing in the atmosphere. Even though you could still have underground nuclear testing. Ready to go to the next slide? Vietnam. Well, guys, basically, we had made a commitment to South Vietnam, even though we were declared neutral in the Geneva Accords of 1954. Basically, the thing breaks down into a power struggle between the communist insurgents and the Royal Laotian Army. Both sides were being funded by the US and the USSR. And basically in 1961, the powers all agree to stop sending aid. Which they still do, except now, however, they do it secretly. Kennedy was reluctant to escalate things in Vietnam. The Joint Chiefs of Staff really pressured him. And you get Ngo Dinh Diem, who was the South Vietnamese premier, who once again was Catholic. And even though he's in a Buddhist majority country, he felt like everybody needed to be Catholic. And of course you had opposition that started to rise up to Diem, like his stern tactics, that it seemed where he was more interested in putting down the Buddhist majority, as well as other critics than the communists. And he says he needs more troops. So military advisors, they want to send more troops. Kennedy, however, refuses. And instead sending more advisors to help stabilize the situation. In 1960, we had 2,000 military advisors there. And by 1963, we have up to 16,000. Well, by 1963, you had differing reports on South Vietnam. Like I said, because of our policy of containment, basically by November of 1963, we'd spent more than $185 million in South Vietnam. I'm ready to go to the next slide. Then on June 10th, 1963, you had a Buddhist monk that went in front of the American embassy in Saigon, got out a can of gasoline, poured it over himself, committing what's known as self-immolation, because he set himself on fire. But just to show you how distant Diem's family was towards this, his sister-in-law laughingly referred to this as a Buddhist barbecue. You start getting inflated kill ratios by the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Public and economic reforms aren't made. Kennedy administration decided that Diem was a lost cause, proposing that a coup d'etat happen against him. And on November 1st, the government was seized and Diem was murdered. The generals, however, that were put in charge provide no more stability than the earlier regimes. And basically you just have continual successive coups that are happening in that government. Ready to go to the next slide? Then we get to Dallas. Well, why was Kennedy in Texas in the first place? Because Kennedy had flown into Houston, and he basically was a tour. He flew into Austin, went to Houston, then flew to Dallas. Well, actually, he flew to Fort Worth, and got up that morning, was going to come spend the afternoon here in Dallas. And guys, the reason why he's here is because his economic plans had pretty much failed. And he was not that popular. And on November 22nd, 1963, as he's making that turn in Dealey Plaza, Lee Harvey Oswald basically shot him from the 6th floor of the book depository. Now, a lot of people who say, oh, he was totally innocent, he was totally innocent. Guys, as he escaped from that warehouse to the Texas Theater, he shot a police officer, Officer Tippit, and he did kill him. And if you're interested in all the because there are a lot of cool conspiracies. Like Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. Kennedy, JFK, died in a Lincoln Continental. Both Lincoln and Kennedy have 7 letters in their name. The assassin of the assassin of Lincoln shot him in a theater and fled to a barn or a warehouse. The guy who shot Kennedy shot him from a warehouse and ran to a theater. Was he guilty? We don't know, because as he was being transferred from the county jails to a more secure facility, basically Jack Ruby, who basically was a strip club owner, and he had basically just gotten done wiring money to one of his strippers who said, "Hey, I need help paying my rent." He just wired that. He walked into the basement of the police department, and a cop basically turned his back for just a second because he wanted to go out and make sure there was no traffic in the streets. And in that split second, basically Oswald made his way in. And like I said, because he carried a lot of cash on him, he usually also carried a gun. When he saw Lee Harvey Oswald coming off the elevator, he became so enraged that he shot him. And if you want to see a movie that really is about a whole lot of conspiracies, even though they try to present it like it's only one guy in his conspiracy, it's a lot of conspiracies kind of combined together to make it sound more believable. It's a JFK, the movie by Oliver Stone. So Kennedy is assassinated. And guys, that might have been one of the best things that could have happened to America. Beyond the new frontier. Now that might sound cold and callous, but basically Johnson was able to use the corpse of Kennedy to pass so much civil rights stuff that the country wasn't ready for at the time, but all he'd say is, well, Kennedy wanted it. And of course everybody would feel guilty. Okay, let's vote it in. Now, who was Johnson? Basically, he was an unrivaled congressman. He was a Texan who could fit himself to fit almost any occasion. He was a worker and achiever, animated by greed, ambition, and an all-consuming lust for power. He was an overbearing man, capable of ruthlessness and deceit, but he also could be warm, caring, friendly, generous, and he actually did display genuine concern for the disadvantaged in society. Basically, what did he want to use his presidency to do? He wanted to use it to build a better society where progress was the servant of the neediest. Ready to go to the next slide? He was able to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, basically by saying let there be no memorial or eulogy for Kennedy other than the Civil Rights Bill that he said Kennedy strongly favored. What did the Civil Rights Act of 1964 do? Basically, it made it illegal to discriminate for reasons of race, religion, or gender. By the way, he used the same pen to sign that bill that Truman had used to sign the order desegregating the military. Ready to go to the next slide? Basically, he began a war on poverty and building a great society that would attack racial injustice and poverty. Now, why was this so important? Well, 9.3 million American families, or 20% of the population, were below the poverty line of just $3,000 a year for a family of four. Indeed, Johnson stated in his first State of the Union speech, unfortunately, many Americans live on the outskirts of hope, some because of poverty, some because of their color, and all too many because of both. Indeed, LBJ claimed this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. Well, how are you going to lift people out of poverty? Well, basically, you're going to do it through education and better schools. Give them an expanded opportunity, improve their social environment. So with the Economic Opportunity Bill, you had a wide range of programs, like Job Corps for the inner city youths, Head Start programs, work-study jobs, grant to farmers and rural businesses, loans to those that hired the chronically unemployed. You had Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA. That was a community action program. Indeed, speaking at Ann Arbor, Michigan, in 1964, Johnson called for a great society with abundance and liberty for all. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, how are the conservatives going to take it? Well, not too great. The Republicans were convinced that the Democrats were only trying to make more efficient the changes and reforms of their predecessors and wanted to drift away from the old dogma and find an intellectual new conservatism. Barry Goldwater was nominated. He was a millionaire department store magnate that proposed abolition of the income tax, the sale of the Tennessee Valley Authority, or that group of 20 to 30 dams that generated electricity for that totally impoverished area in Tennessee, and basically overhauling Social Security. He opposed both the nuclear test bans as well as the Civil Rights Act. You had guys like William F. Buckley, who said that basically all these government programs were destroying localism, self-help, individualism. That all this stuff was being destroyed and weakened. Basically, they argued that the Supreme Court had violated their constitutional power. Well, go in a little bit. Sorry, I had to change batteries. Now, why would the conservatives be so worried about the Supreme Court? Getting ready to go to the next slide. Because during this time, the court was known as the Warren Court, because the Chief Justice was Earl Warren, who in 1962 had ruled that school prayer in New York State Board of Regents violated constitutional prohibition from an established religion. Also, they had passed stuff like Gideon v. Wainwright in 1963, where the court ruled that every felony defendant be provided a lawyer regardless of the defendant's ability to pay. And you also had the case of they had released 14 communists in Yates v. the United States. And in the case of Miranda v. Arizona, basically that's the case that we get our Miranda rights from. Now, to start the whole thing up, Miranda had been arrested, but he wouldn't talk And I mean, the guy was totally guilty. It was obvious that he had robbed stuff from a store. But he refused to talk. So the police officers kept him in jail and wouldn't allow him to use the bathroom or go to sleep until he confessed. And after 40 hours, he had urine-soaked pants, he was exhausted, and Miranda gave a brief confession. Well, the Supreme Court ordered that the accused person in police custody must be informed of certain basic rights, like the right to remain silent, the right to know that anything said can be used against you in a court of law, and that you have a right to an attorney present during interrogation. All of this must be done and informed of before questioning could begin. And Miranda was released, but then the cops just arrested him on something else and he was finally found guilty. But basically the thing that scared the that was so unique about the Warren Court is basically they truly believed on the rights of individuals. And that the government had to follow a due process before they could deprive their citizens of any of their rights or property. Ready to go to the next slide? Now, you did have cases coming up with the distribution of sexually explicit material. More decisions that would forbid prayer, forbidding the Bible, permitting contraceptives to be distributed. Ready to go to the next slide? So you have the election of 1964. Johnson v. Goldwater. Goldwater ad, in your heart you know he's right. To which, of course, Johnson's ad was in his guts, you know he's nuts. And it was a sweeping victory for Johnson. Indeed, the night before the election, there was one 30-second TV commercial played called Daisy. Y'all can look it up on YouTube. It's the Daisy ad. And needless to say, that was quite shocking. Ready for the next slide? So the results basically of this election were a landslide victory for Johnson, 61% of the total votes, 486 electoral votes to Goldwater's 52. Johnson, however, knew every day I'm in office, I'm going to lose votes. I'm going to alienate somebody. We've got to get this legislation fast. You've got to get it during my honeymoon. And he was able to put in more than 60 programs into place, offering a better economic and social opportunity, or removing barriers. He also appointed, like Robert C. Weaver, to head the Housing and Urban Development, who was the first black cabinet member in America. A new Immigration Act was passed of 1965 that redressed quotas placed on those from Southern and Eastern Europe and the developing continents of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. He didn't hesitate to use Martin Luther King Jr. to help garner support for his programs. Ready to go to the next slide? Then we have Freedom Summer. Where once again white and black activists took part in this. Basically you had college students from New England that would go down to economically depressed areas in the South and teach them summer classes in the so-called freedom schools. And was society ready for that? No. From June to August of 1964, there were more than 35 shootings of the people who had gone from the north to the south. You had 30 buildings bombed. You had hundreds beaten, including 6 killed. Well, does that mean that the slow march to civil rights is going to stop? No. You had the Freedom March, which was basically a plan to march from Selma to Montgomery. Where Sheriff Jim Clark and 50 troopers basically prevented him from crossing a bridge, utilizing tear gas, clubs, whips. But once again, there were TVs there to catch this and get it out of the local area to a national audience. Ready for the next slide? And Johnson's reaction was basically to call out the National Guard, 2 Army battalions, 250 field marshals, and by March 25th, Montgomery was reached with 35,000 people. Days before the march, Johnson had gone before Congress asking for the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And at the end of his plea, he repeated, "And we shall overcome." It passed, basically ensuring that all citizens have the right to vote, authorizing the Attorney General to dispatch federal examiners to register voters. The act suspended literacy tests and other devices that have been used to defraud citizens of the right to vote. And by the end of the year, 250,000 blacks were newly registered. And guys, Johnson was passing these things that had never been done, but he also passed other programs, like the Appalachian Regional Development Act, the Model Cities Act, the Housing Act, or bill. Funds were given to urban and mass transit developments. And you also had Medicare passed for the aged. Basically, it was a medical insurance for those over 65. And Medicaid for the indigent or extremely poor. They put more than $1.5 billion in federal aid to elementary and secondary education, passed specifically to extending aid to poverty impacted districts. They also passed a Highway Safety Act, the Traffic Safety Act, to establish safety standards for automobiles. You have the Higher Education Act providing scholarships for college students. Ready to go to the next slide? Of course, Lady Bird, his wife, also helped out. She passed the National Wildlife Preservation Act, the Clean Water Restoration Act. Something she did specifically for Texas is all the wildflowers that you see growing along the side of the interstates. That basically was started by her. That program. Ready to go to the next slide? But by 1966, Johnson is starting to lose popularity. Basically, the war in Vietnam, the partisan politics that were ripping apart the country, showed that basically by 1968, America was ready for a change. And Johnson at the Democratic Convention, National Convention, shocks everybody when he says that he will not seek nor will he accept the nomination of president by the Democratic Party. New agendas. Well, guys, you had tears in the steam. Basically, less than a week after the passage of the landmark Voting Rights Bill. On August 11th, 1965, Watts, a predominantly impoverished black area in Los Angeles, exploded into a frenzy of riots and looting. Basically, Watts was a 50 square mile area of 250,000 residents, more than 34% of which were unemployed. Basically, on August 11th, 1965, a black guy was arrested, which led to a struggle, which led to calling out of the National Guard, which turned into a 36-hour riot, leaving 34 dead, 28 on the scene. The others died later of their injuries. More than 900 people injured, and more than $40 million in property damage. You also have riots occurring in Chicago, Cleveland, and 40 other cities. Detroit was probably the most graphic example. Detroit was probably the most graphic example where you had tanks rolling through the streets, soldiers having to use machine guns to deal with snipers in the buildings. Ready to go to the next slide? Up. What the hey? What the? Basically, you have the rise of the Black Panthers. People like Stokely Carmichael said, hell, we don't need no damn dreams. We want jobs. The Black Power movement, basically to stop what they felt were police abuses in their neighborhoods, is that if a cop pulled somebody over, then basically the black population that were Black Panthers would go out, they'd stay a respectful distance away, but it would all be open carry. They'd have their shotguns, they'd have their bandoliers, they'd have their rifles, pistols. If he posed with a smile, meet him with a smile. If he posed with a gun, meet him with a gun. Ready to go to the next slide? Basically, you had guys like Bob Moses, who had been a follower of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who left. Stokely Carmichael, who I told you about earlier, said, I'm not going to beg any white man for anything I deserve. I'm going to take it. And basically, the Black Power movement became a rallying cry from those who had become disenchanted with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We reject any American dream defined by white people and must work to construct an American reality defined by Afro-Americans. See, on one hand, here's conservatives calling Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. At communist training school. Meanwhile, black supporters were calling him Dr. Chicken Wing. Ready for the next slide? But perhaps the biggest threat were the black Muslims, whose most articulate speaker was Malcolm Little, who later on changed his name to Malcolm X after he converted to Islam in prison. The Elijah Muhammad, by 1960, had more than 100,000 members of the black Muslims. And basically Malcolm X began to speak messages of militant empowerment. Eventually he would split with the black Muslims. Shortly after his autobiography was published in 1965. And there you see a picture of him with a rifle sitting by his window. That was taken the day that he was kicked out of his home by the Muslim church that said they owned the home, not him. He was worried that something might happen to his family, so he was trying to protect them. Was he right for being worried? Well, a couple months later, he was gunned down. He was assassinated and murdered by a rival black Muslim group. Both the book, the autobiography of Malcolm X, is really interesting, as well as the movie Malcolm X, made by Spike Lee. You might want to check those out. And the sad thing is that Malcolm X got gunned down when he kind of abandoned his strident anti-white rhetoric, preaching a more biracial message of social change, especially as he had gone off to Mecca and made the trek and came back. Now, what can we say about the Black Power movement? Well, it never attracted more than a small minority of African Americans, only 15%. Indeed, most of the blacks in America continued to adhere to Martin Luther King Jr.'s voice of nonviolent integration. But two positive things did split out of the Black Power movement. First, it helped blacks to take pride in their racial heritage. Indeed, Malcolm X said the worst crime the white man committed has been to teach us to hate ourselves. But secondly, it forced King and other mainstream leaders and organizations to launch a new stage in the civil rights movement, namely the plight of the poor inner city blacks. However, as we're poised for advances to fight poverty in home, something began to commandeer more and more of America's resources. What was that, you might ask? Ready for the next slide? Vietnam. Oh. Should have gotten to this first. Basically, on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered at a hotel room in Memphis. Indeed, the U2 song In the Name of Love is about that day. You know, early morning, April 4, shout rings out in the Memphis sky. Anyway, he was killed by James Earl Ray. Ready to go to the next slide? Vietnam. Well, guys, basically, boop. Vietnam seemed more and more it was an effort to avoid defeat, costing more and more of America's treasure and her sons. In 1965, there were 184,000 troops there. In 1966, there's 385,000. By 1969, we have more than 500,000 troops there at 542,000. Indeed, Johnson described Vietnam as a raggedy, blank, fourth-rate country, not worthy of American blood. And by the time the last American troops left in 1973, more than 58,000 people had died, 300,000 wounded, and $150 billion spent to pretty much divide our nation. Ready for the next slide? Now, how did things escalate so quickly? Well, on August 2nd, 1964, the USS Maddox was in the Gulf of Tonkin, right about there. And it got shot at by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. There you can see a picture of them there. And shelled. And guys, we have the shells. The shrapnel from them that hit the USS Maddox. So we were hit. Well, they send up the Sea Turner Joy to join the Maddox. And on April 4th, 1964, really stormy seas. You have the crew on edge and everything like that. Visibility was almost next to nothing. All of a sudden they start sighting, hey, torpedoes are being fired at us again. Everybody's worried. And in reality, torpedoes probably weren't fired that day. But we had been shot at on August 2nd. But it was the April 4th incident that Johnson utilized to tell the U.S. public on August 7th, 1964, that our ships had been attacked by North Vietnamese vessels of war on August 2nd and 4th in the Gulf of Tonkin. And we claim that the attacks were unprovoked, as our ships were there to assist the South Vietnamese in their attacks on North Vietnam. And basically he asked for a resolution to be passed that gave the president the authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. So basically this was like his authority to increase our troops. Ready for the next slide? Now, we also needed increased bombing, and the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese were nice enough to assist that when they attacked Pleiku on February 5th, 1965, where the Viet Cong killed 8 and wounded 126 Americans. And further attacks allowed Johnson to begin Operation Rolling Thunder, which basically was a sustained bombing of North Vietnam intended to stop the flow of soldiers and supply to the south. And you can see it in red. Basically, it's just a kind of a trail, old animal tracks, everything like that, through the jungles that they would take goods from the north down to the rebels in the south. And after 6 months of bombing, a task force was conducted where they did an extensive study on the bombing's effect on supplies flowing down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And pretty much they concluded there's no real way to stop the traffic that's going down. Yeah, General William C. Westmoreland, Army's commander in Vietnam, who began sending out search and destroy missions. And as combat missions increased, so do the list of casualties and body count of enemy dead. Now, once again, why are we in Vietnam? Well, it was consistent with earlier foreign policy goals. Indeed, it was felt that we were there because we had a promise to keep. To leave Vietnam to its fate would shake the confidence of all these people in the value of American commitment. And we felt that if we lost Vietnam, we feared that other South Asian countries would fall like a bunch of dominoes. The only problem is American troop strength and actions couldn't be large enough to bring, they had to be large, but not so large that they might bring in China or the USSR. So our goal wasn't really to win the war, it was to prevent the North Vietnamese from winning. Now, when you add this to the fact that nightly TV shows not only pictured the American dead, but also protests against the war, it weakened American morale. I mean, think of it. Now, even though we are at our current conflict and the war against terror, guys, it's lasted longer than Vietnam. But why do you think the government doesn't show people getting wounded, doesn't show the dead, doesn't show anything? Because basically they learned their lesson from Vietnam. That's why most of the pictures that we see of like a strike or something like that is a camera on one of our smart bombs. And usually it's just blowing up a building. It's not hurting people. Ready to go to the next slide? Got to see, is this still in focus? The turning point. Basically on January 31st, 1968, which was the first day of the Vietnamese New Year, or Tet, basically there was supposed to be a truce between both sides. And as if y'all didn't know, in Asia, New Year is a huge celebration. Well, basically that's when North Vietnam decided to break the truce and attack us. They basically attacked us at more than 40 places across South Vietnam on the same day. including the old capital city of Hue. They were even able to occupy the U.S. Embassy grounds in Saigon for 15 minutes. But all the ground was won back. And General Westmoreland, we militarily defeated them because they did try to go toe-to-toe against us. But basically back here at home, the people, especially when Walter Cronkite said he didn't think this war was winnable anymore, made the support for this war evaporate. Ready for the next slide? The results for Johnson, he plummeted to only a 35% approval rating, lower than any president since Truman's darkest days. By 1968, the U.S. was spending $322,000 for every communist killed in Vietnam, whereas our War on Poverty programs received only $53 a person. And basically, as the war continued, Johnson had less and less of the vote. Shocking everybody on March 31st, where Johnson announced a halt to the bombing of North Vietnam, fresh initiatives for a ceasefire, and added, "I have concluded that I should not permit the presidency to become involved in the partisan divisions that are developing in this political year. Accordingly, I shall not seek and will not accept the nomination of my party for another term of as your president." Oh, and by the way, guys, the U.S. dropped more bombs in Vietnam than we dropped in all of World War II. Ready to go to the next slide? The crescendo of the 60s. Well, there you see a nice little looking group, you know, they're all happy, kind of sitting together, you know, like they're all kind of a family. They're on an old movie lot, studio lot, that they promised the guy that they'd take care of it and keep it clean, and he let them live there. And like I said, you know, they're kind of like a big group, all loving each other. Well, that's the Manson family. And that's Charlie Manson. And they basically kill Hollywood actress Sharon Tate and the baby within her, as well as two other people. Wrote Helter Skelter on the walls and everything like that. Because good old Charles Manson had listened to the White Album by the Beatles. And he thought that they were telling him that he needed to start a race war in the United States. And the way he'd do that is by making it look like black people had done this. Really weird book, Helter Skelter. Also, the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is about that. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, the tragedies of 1968. Not only do we have Martin Luther King Jr. getting assassinated, but Robert Kennedy was also assassinated. JFK's brother. Basically, in the election of 1968, the Democrats nominate Hubert Humphrey, who was over a very disjointed party. And at his Democratic convention up in Chicago, you had cops coming in, physically and violently breaking up protests. So it looked very chaotic. Meanwhile, on the other hand, the Republicans, their convention in Florida was very quiet. Their nominee was Richard Milhouse Nixon. And his big promise was, hey, we're going to turn this country back to stability and order. after he had lost to Kennedy, he'd said, oh, you're not going to have Nixon to kick around anymore. Well, what he had done is he had gone around building up his power base wisely to make sure that he could be the nominee. Now, meanwhile, one thing that makes this a wild card race is that you have an independent splitting off by George Wallace, who's all about the states' rights party. Now, what was his danger? His danger was that he might take away votes, and by taking away those votes, he could throw the election to the other candidate. Kind of like if Bernie Sanders had gone and ran as an independent against Hillary, or like he might do against Biden. That would make sure that the Republicans would win, or the other party would win, because you have that third candidate. Ready for the next slide? What are the results? Well, it's a very narrow victory for Nixon. Even though Wallace did receive more than 100,000 votes. And that, I believe, President Nixon. So guys, once again, just like Kennedy, basically Nixon ruled from the political center. Indeed, he started whole agencies that might think are very liberal. Like he was the guy that created the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, or the Office Safety, Health and Standards Association. The NTSB, which has to do with traffic, which is why after 1973 you have to have a seat belt in your car. And he would lavishly spend on social services and environmental initiatives. Things for the environment, things to clean things up. Ready to go to the next slide? Nixon and welfare, he was even for something called the Family Assistance Plan, which basically would have assured every American a guaranteed annual income of, I believe it was $20,000. It was defeated, but he said he gave his support to it. And once again, why is he doing this? Because, guys, Nixon was a political animal. To consolidate his support, basically he's appointed conservative nominees to the Supreme Court, which, of course, the Senate reacted by trying to block them. Meanwhile, the Philadelphia Plan was a plan within the labor unions it was kind of like an affirmative action for labor unions to help increase their minority participants. But the trade unions totally reject this. Alright, you ready to go to the next slide? Because now you have the Burger Court, which did stuff like in the case of Swan via the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education, said that it was okay to bus in students from a more diverse population than the actual school district might reflect. So in other words, you'd start having minorities in what had historically been all white schools. You see the biggest fights against this, like up in Boston. The whole deal about inequality in schooling here in Texas, where, you know, you have some school districts that are richer than other districts. They tried to address that in the case of San Antonio v. Rodriguez, trying to make it where, hey, all the school districts give their money to the state. State then turns around and gives everybody an equal amount. That was only defeated by one vote. So now we have Robin Hood, which, by the way, was ruled unconstitutional by the Texas Supreme Court. So the legislatures have to try to think of a new way, and they're not touching it with a 10-foot pole. Ready to go to the next slide? Diplomatically, Nixon and détente. Under Nixon, the Secretary of State is Henry Kissinger. Very brilliant diplomat who basically had no problem undermining governments deemed dangerous to America's interests. You have an alteration of the Cold War politics, and that basically it used to be the Soviets were all treated as one bloc. So it was thought, hey, communist nations like Russia and China, they're exactly the same. Well, guys, they're not. Indeed, they kind of don't like each other. And because the University of Hawaii's ping pong team was invited to a Chinese ping pong tournament, guys, American diplomats were amazed. It may have happened by accident, but they decided to go ahead and use this, and they'd send diplomats along with the ping pong team, and our diplomats would have meetings with their diplomats, which started back in 1972. And through this, we were able to do stuff like open up trade with China, recognizing them. That's why it's called ping pong diplomacy, is because it all started out because of the U.S. ping pong team. And because we're getting closer to China, well, Russia, they don't want to be left out. So a SALT treaty is signed with them, limiting nuclear arms. Getting ready to go to the next slide. But then we have Nixon and Watergate. And guys, this is really sad because, anyway. You ready? Basically, in 1968, Nixon announces that he has a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. Basically, how was he going to do it? He was going to do it through Vietnamization. Hey, it's their war, let them fight it. Kind of like we did in Iraq. After we went there, got rid of Saddam Hussein. Yeah, we stood around for a little bit just to make sure that stability was there. But once that stability was received, we'll slowly withdraw the troops. Because it's Iraq's war. Let them fight for it. That was the same exact thing that was going to happen in Vietnam. Ready for the next slide? Now, of course, here in America, you had a lot of people that were frustrated that our sons were still dying in the war. At Kent State in Ohio, 4 students were shot and killed by National Guard members. At Jackson State, you had a guy who was a sniper in one of the university buildings shooting down at the National Guard. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, the public support for it goes way down, especially after the revelation of the My Lai massacre, where the village of My Lai, that was mainly populated by women and young children, American troops got frustrated by what they believed was their continual hiding and support of the Viet Cong. So about 40 the villagers, once again, these are basically women and children, were gunned down and killed by American soldiers. Ready for the next slide? in 74 we have the Paris Peace Agreement, or 75, that basically ends America's involvement in Vietnam, in South Vietnam. Even though we promised South Vietnam, hey, we'll continue to support you, we'll continue to give you weapons, we'll continue to give you loans, but our guys aren't fighting there anymore. So we kept our goals in Vietnam. When we left, there was still a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam. Ready for the next slide? Then we get Watergate. Okay, guys, Nixon was somebody who was obsessed with secrecy. And this was shortly after you had the Pentagon Papers released, that basically someone had found out some of the stuff that the CIA had done. And so basically, Nixon hired G. Gordon Liddy and a bunch of plumbers, that's what they were called, to go and stop the leaks. Now, the Democratic National Headquarters was at the Watergate Hotel. And guys, there was no reason for the CREEP, which is the Committee to Re-elect the President, I know, weird name, for them to break into the Democratic National Headquarters. But Nixon, who'd been defeated by Kennedy when nobody thought Kennedy would defeat him. You know, I'm sure that's the way that Hillary felt about Trump. You know, it can't happen. Well, he was so shocked by that, that even though he would have easily won the upcoming election, he had to make sure. So basically, these G. Gordon Liddy and the others, and by the way, we don't know, I don't believe that he, or it hasn't been proven that he told them to go do this, but they got caught trying to break in. Security men just happened to catch them. And immediately this starts a cover-up at the White House. And the legislative branch asks for release of Nixon's tapes to them. Now, Nixon had all these microphones all over the White House that were constantly recording, especially if you met with a foreign diplomat. You know, and the reason why you do that is so that if you remember what you said or promised to the other people, as well as what they said or promised to you. Guys, that had been in the White House since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But Nixon says, no, I don't have to give you those tapes because that's part of the executive branch, not the legislative branch. Well, they get into a quabble about it. Finally, the Supreme Court rules that, yes, you do have to surrender the tapes to the legislative branch. Only problem is, there's 15 minutes that are missing on those tapes that have never been found. Have no idea what they said. By August of 1974, the House Judiciary Committee is formed to start to talk about the process of impeachment. Nixon, however, always one step ahead of the game. He resigns before he can be impeached. And what's the response? Basically, you have Frank Church and the Church Committee that really cracks down on the powers of the CIA and limits their actions. And what was the effect of Nixon's resignation on liberals and liberalism? Well, guys, everybody, yeah, we got rid of him. Yeah, he was so conservative. Yeah. Well, guys, you haven't really had an on-fire liberal president since Nixon, who did all this stuff like the Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, all this liberal stuff. Guys, even Barack Obama, he really didn't do too many changes. Interesting. And that should be the end. Yep. Okay, so guys, basically remember, we're going to be having a quiz on Friday. I'll post up what the review on Wednesday for our quiz on Friday. All right? Okay.